Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending Hyde Marine's webinar, Understanding the Misconceptions about the IMO and U.S. Coast Guard Ballast Water Regulations. This webinar marks the first of several webinars to be hosted by Hyde Marine. Please check our website periodically for the updates, date, and times of upcoming presentations. If you have questions during the presentation, please type them in the question box and direct them specifically to the host. After the presentation, we will try to address as many questions as possible. This webinar will be recorded and posted on our website. Please visit us at www.hydemarine.com or at our Facebook and LinkedIn pages for up-to-date ballast water information. Please note that this presentation contains historical information and forward-looking statements and include Hyde Marine's interpretation of the landscape. Our speaker today is Mr. Mark Riggio, Product Manager at Hyde Marine. A graduate of the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy, Mr. Riggio started his career as a surveyor for ABS. He also worked for Crowley Maritime Corporation as a port engineer and later operated his own consulting company. As port engineer of the MV Cape Washington, Mr. Riggio helped design the first permanent shipboard ballast water testing facility as part of the Merck development team. At Hyde Marine, Mr. Riggio works very closely with all development efforts of our product and has very intimate involvement in the regulatory approval process. It's my pleasure to introduce Mark Riggio and pass the floor to him.
Good afternoon, most of you. Good morning to those of you on the West Coast. We have a very big topic to talk about today, so we'll dive right in. Up on the screen, you see our agenda for today. We'll be talking about the IMO convention, updating where the convention is at this time, and looking at the implementation schedule. We'll also be talking about the U.S. Coast Guard's ballast water management requirements, the Environmental Protection Agency's Vessel General Permit, U.S. Coast Guard EPA enforcement, the advantages of installing an AMS-approved system, U.S. Coast Guard type approval, and finally the validity of UV systems in the U.S. Ballast water management systems originate from the 2004 convention, IMO Convention on Ballast Water Treatment. This convention has yet to come into force. As a requirement of the convention, it needs to be ratified by more than 30 countries representing 35% of world tonnage. As you can see from the charts on the screen, to the left you show that there is a little more than 30% of the world tonnage that is currently signatory, 30.38%. And there are 38 countries, far exceeding the required 30. On the right-hand side is a list of the countries that have yet to sign, the predominant countries that have yet to sign. On this slide, we see again the notable exceptions, countries that would have a capability to push over the convention. At this time, we require ratification by an additional 4.62% of world tonnage for the full implementation of the Ballast Water Management Convention. Looking at the chart above, the Republic of Panama, the People's Republic of China, Hong Kong Special Administrative Area, Singapore, Greece, or Malta, singularly, if they ratified, could push the tonnage over the limit. Additionally, the Bahamas, the People's Republic of China, and the United Kingdom have a significant amount of tonnage that could be applied towards getting us to the 35% limit. According to the original IMO Ballast Water Convention, this was the timeline. Obviously, looking at where we are today, we should be fully in the ballast water treatment market with all new vessels that have been built since 2012 having fitted systems and the first retrofits being done of vessels between 1,500 and 5,000 cubic meters per hour, cubic meters of capacity. Obviously, that has not happened. The convention has been a little slow to be ratified, to be fair. Most recently at the IMO MEPC 65 meeting, a number of shipowner organizations presented a letter asking for dispensation from the IMO in order to meet their concerns about the implementation of the Ballast Water Management Convention. Key to their concerns was the 2.5-year window for implementation, enforcement of the discharge standard, and the ships that had been built since 2009 that had not installed a system at new construction. During MEPC 65, the IMO agreed with all of these and issued an amendment to the IMO convention, which was passed by the committee and was accepted by the IMO General Assembly, granting the ship owners all of their required changes. So now the Ballast Water Management Convention is no longer tied to dry docking. It's tied to the MARPOL certificate for a vessel. So the first renewal of the MARPOL certificate following the implementation date for that vessel. They suspended the enforcement of the discharge standard until approximately 2016 to give 3 years for vessel operators to run systems and gather data to find out if they were working. And they made all vessels at the time of the implementation of the Ballast Water Management Convention existing vessels under the requirements, so that they would fall into the standard existing vessel requirements regardless of their keel laid dates. This created a new implementation schedule shown on this slide. Now this slide assumes a ratification in second quarter of 2014, and you'll see that there's very little room left simply for new construction vessels and very little differentiation between the roll-in time between the size classes 0 to 1,500 cubic meters, 1,500 to 5,000 cubic meters, and 5,000 plus cubic meters, because the convention comes into force 12 months from the date that it's ratified. So ratification in the second quarter of 2014 means that the convention comes into place in the second quarter of 2015. Looking at this graph from another standpoint, you can see this two implementation curves. The red line indicates the number of ships per year that would need to be fitted with a ballast water management system in accordance with the original IMO implementation dates. The yellowish line, orangish line, represents the new MEPC 65 implementation dates if the Ballast Water Management Convention were to be implemented in the second quarter of 2014. As you can see, the line is much steeper and much more abrupt change from 2014, when no vessels are required under the IMO, until 2016, when you reach a rated average implementation of approximately 1/60th of the world's fleet every month that needs to be brought into compliance with the convention. This line represents today. You can see we are somewhat at the precipice of this large act, again, based upon what happens with the IMO convention and ratification. The more ratification pushes out, the more that line, the yellow line, becomes a straight vertical line coming 1 year from the date of implementation. At the most recent meeting, as you've seen in the press, undoubtedly, the International Chamber of Shipping, supported by many other shipowner associations, introduced a new letter to the MEPC. They requested both at the PPG-1 and MEPC 66 that they consider reopening the G8 requirements. The ICS suggested that type approval testing that had been done to date needed to be improved, that there needed to be increased transparency in the testing, and that there was some vagaries about how testing was done in different areas, and there was different levels of robustness done for the testing. The IMO did not accept this request, but they did, as a sign of good faith to the Shipowners Association, commissioned a study of the use and the effectiveness of in-use ballast water treatment systems within the next 3 years. One thing that was not brought to the table during MEPC 66 or PPG-1 was any evidence of ballast water treatment systems that were in use that were not functioning in their shipboard applications. And that was specifically asked for following PPG-1 by the MEPC 66 group, and it was not presented. So the IMO has yet to pass their requirements, and this law is still coming into force at some future date. However, at this time, we do have one ballast water treatment requirement that is in force and is impacting commerce at this time, and that's the U.S. Coast Guard Ballast Water Rule. The U.S. Coast Guard final rule became law in June of 2012. The first implementation dates under this final rule have already passed. New construction vessels with a keel laid date after December 1st, 2013 are required to be fitted with a system either prior to delivery or prior to their first visit to the United States. Additionally, vessels between a ballast capacity of 1,500 and 5,000 cubic meters of total ballast starting January 1st are required to fit systems at their first scheduled dry docking, out-of-water dry docking, following January 1st, 2014. The U.S. Coast Guard requires these vessels to fit their systems at that first out-of-water dry docking after the anniversary date. This is not tied to the MARPOL certificate or to the renewal certificate or to the COI. This is simply tied to the first scheduled out-of-water dry docking. Emergency dry dockings would not count for this requirement unless the vessel chooses to take credit for the emergency dry docking towards their regularly scheduled required out-of-water dry docking. And the final rule requires that ships must be fitted either with a U.S. Coast Guard type-approved ballast water management system, or they must be registered in the STEP program in order for those systems to be permanently used in the United States. There are four other options that exist under the U.S. Coast Guard final rule to comply at this time. Under the final rule, vessels may choose alternate means of complying. There are four. The first is to use water from a U.S. public water supply system that meets 40 CFR Parts 141 and 143. Second, you may simply not discharge any ballast into U.S. waters. That's fully acceptable. Third, you may discharge to a facility onshore or to another vessel for the purposes of treatment. At this point in time in the United States, there are no such onshore facilities or vessels available for such treatment, but that it does exist as a potential for use in the future for compliance. And finally, number four, the ship owner may install an alternate management system that meets the requirements of 33 CFR 151:2026. Most of you probably know, but a alternate management system is a ballast water treatment system that has achieved approval by a foreign administration and may be granted approval by the U.S. Coast Guard under Section 151:2026. In order to receive this certification, the manufacturer must prove that the system is at least as effective as ballast water exchange. And this approval gives owners and operators 5 years to operate the system after the vessel's compliance date, and this allows the manufacturer to, during that 5-year period of time, achieve U.S. Coast Guard type approval for that system so that owners then would not have to replace the system later if the system can pass type approval. One other key is that that is 5 years from the vessel's compliance date, not necessarily the date that the vessel had the system installed. So for a new construction vessel, that vessel may have been keel laid prior to 1 December 2013. The vessel has an AMS system installed at delivery and either has its intermediate first dry docking waived or conducts a UWILD so that it doesn't do its first out-of-water dry docking for 5 years after delivery. That owner would then have 5 more years after the first scheduled out-of-water dry docking for a total of 10 years of operating life out of the AMS system without having to replace it. And then in that 5 years, presumably the manufacturer would have achieved U.S. Coast Guard type approval. And so that system would be acceptable for continued use. This slide shows a graphical representation of the U.S. Coast Guard timeline as specified by the final rule. Again, you can see on the top line new vessels starting in 1 December 2013. All new vessels are required on delivery. For vessels between 1,500 and 5,000 cubic meters of ballast capacity, they must install at that first dry docking between 1 January 2014 and whenever they complete that survey. And for vessels less than 1,500 and more than 5,000, again, starting 1 January 2016, the first scheduled out-of-water dry docking. And again, based upon an owner's capability to either have a dry docking waived or to conduct a UWILD, that can stretch from 2 to out as long as 5 years, based upon the regulations. So at this point in time, there's an additional factor that plays in, and that is the U.S. Coast Guard has begun to issue extensions to the implementation date for ballast water treatment systems. The U.S. Coast Guard started issuing these extensions on December 27, 2013. These extensions have been granted due to the reported vessels not being able to meet the requirements. And the basis of this is that there are no U.S. Coast Guard type-approved systems currently available, despite the fact that the regulation does allow for AMS as being fully compliant with the regulation at this time. Extension requests are being granted on a ship-by-ship basis, and every extension is posted on the U.S. Coast Guard's website. Currently, there are over 110 ships listed on the U.S. Coast Guard's website, and the web address there is listed for your use if you'd care to go and check out that list of vessels. This slide shows the first 17 ships which received U.S. Coast Guard extensions. There are a couple of key features to this chart that I'd like to point out to the audience. The first is that all of these extensions have been issued to the same date, the date of 1 January 2016, the date that coincides with the implementation for the next round of vessels. Additionally, most of these vessels are in excess of 20 years of age. When you look back to our analysis of IMO charting, you'll notice that we made certain assumptions. 45,000 ships are being retrofit, and that is essentially assuming that any vessel over 20 years of age will not install systems due to the cost relative to the value of the vessel. So most of these vessels would not have been counted in that number. Finally, I draw your attention to the bottom. There's pictures of 4 ships. It's key to remember that this date is not an anniversary date. This is the 1 January 2016 is a fixed hard date. So each of these vessels has completed a dry docking period, presumably sometime after January 1st, 2014, and they will have to install a ballast water management system if one is available, a type-approved system is available, before the 1st of January 2016, regardless of whether they are going back into a dry dock or regardless of whether they have a repair period scheduled. For the 2 vessels that you see on the left, those are small bulk carriers, fairly simple to install those underway. The cruise vessel you see, the third from the left, Hyde Marine has done well over a dozen onboard installations of cruise ships with 0 downtime to the operator. That owner probably has made a reasonable assumption that they can install a system without going out of service. But I draw your attention to the vessel on the far right, a small LNG carrier, likely on a time charter, and likely will have to try and retrofit a system on that vessel sometime within the next 2 years that will likely cause that vessel to have to go out of service or face interruptions to its service and may have to break its time charter agreements depending on how those agreements have been written. That owner has gambled heavily on the ability to install an underway ballast water treatment system and probably hasn't made a terribly wise selection in going for an extension rather than installing a system at this time. So as we said, there are 94 more vessels listed on the U.S. Coast Guard's website provided earlier to you. So again, I want to reiterate a couple of key facts about U.S. Coast Guard extensions. All 110 plus extensions issued to date have been issued to the exact same date. It is not an anniversary date, and it is not the first scheduled survey after that date. It is a hard physical date. It is no longer tied to a dry dock or any other survey. Systems must be installed before the 1st of January 2016 even if the ship does not go into a dry dock. And finally, it's important to know that the extensions do not cover compliance with the EPA's Vessel General Permit. They simply cover the requirement under the U.S. Coast Guard's final rule for ballast water management system installation. So in the United States, we have two different sets of rules that vessels must comply with. That was the U.S. Coast Guard's final rule. And now we'll talk a little bit about the EPA and the Vessel General Permit. In 2013, the EPA released and issued its new version of the Vessel General Permit. This permit became effective on December 19, 2013. The Vessel General Permit covers 27 separate discharges from vessels. It requires the development of management practices by vessel owners and mandates the use of what's called best available technology in order to prevent or eliminate as much as possible pollution into the waters of the United States. U.S. Coast Guard AMS systems, AMS-approved systems, are listed as best available technology, clearly indicated in the Vessel General Permit, which means that these systems are fully compliant with the requirements under the Vessel General Permit. As we've said before, the U.S. Coast Guard has granted extensions of this timeline. However, there is no mechanism in the Vessel General Permit for the granting of an extension to an individual vessel or to a vessel operator. In lieu of receiving an extension under the VGP, an owner would have to seek an individual permit under the Clean Water Act in order to avoid installing a ballast water management system and fully comply with the Clean Water Act in the United States. The Vessel General Permit also contains additional sampling and reporting requirements which are in excess of the U.S. Coast Guard final rule and in excess of IMO. We'll talk about those in a minute. The EPA does not have sufficient force and sufficient manpower to enforce the Vessel General Permit on ships. And so enforcement of the Vessel General Permit is done under a memorandum of understanding by the U.S. Coast Guard. This creates obviously a problem because the U.S. Coast Guard has issued extensions of Ballast Water Management Convention implementation dates where the EPA has not. And the EPA has also stated that these extensions of the implementation date are not acceptable under the Vessel General Permit. In order to clear up this issue, a policy letter was issued jointly by the Coast Guard and the EPA stating that enforcement of the numerical discharge standard was a low priority for the EPA, provided the vessels received and were granted a U.S. Coast Guard extension of their ballast water management requirements. This does not, however, mean that these vessels are in compliance. It simply states that they are a low enforcement priority. Vessels still must report on their annual report all violations of the VGP. As the ballast water management section of the VGP is not being complied with, this obligates vessel owners on their annual reports to report this violation of the VGP to the EPA, and these notice of discharge and these annual reports are publicly available through the EPA's website. So it places the situation where the owners are required to publicly indicate to the EPA that their systems are, that they do not fit the system and that they are in violation of the Vessel General Permit. One thing that's not clearly understood but is becoming much more apparent is that under the Clean Water Act, there are certain rights and obligations that are not necessarily routine for other regulations, such as citizens groups and really any party may bring suit against permit violators, not simply the enforcement arm of the government. So this means that citizen and environmental groups may be able to sue individual vessels who discharge without a treatment system if they're in violation of their permit. This is very important because, again, the EPA enforcement letter does not state that the vessels are compliant with the permit. It simply states that they will not seek to enforce penalties and that they will consider these violators to be of a very low enforcement priority, provided that they meet other baseline requirements, such as having an extension. Also important that that letter does not cover vessels that have not received an extension but are discharging in the United States after their first out-of-water dry docking. Finally, the EPA Vessel General Permit does require vessels operating in U.S. waters to periodically sample the effluent from a number of discharges, one of which being ballast water management systems. This sampling must be done 4 times per year for vessels with low quality data, and it must be done twice per year for systems with high quality data. Any system that has achieved U.S. Coast Guard type approval or U.S. Coast Guard AMS approval or AMS designation is considered to have high quality data. Furthermore, if a ship owner has 1 year of successful tests, so 2 tests for vessels with high quality data, 4 tests for vessels with low quality data, in subsequent years, they may reduce that sampling down to half the normal amount. So 2 times per year for low quality, 1 time per year for high quality data. For the EPA, this testing is of indicator organisms only. However, some state requirements are in excess of the EPA's requirements, so it's highly recommended that vessel owners and operators check the Vessel General Permit for any requirements of the operating area of your vessels. Now, these samples must be taken and analyzed by an independent laboratory, not necessarily a Coast Guard certified independent laboratory, but one that is recognized by the EPA. And there are very specific test requirements and protocols that must be followed. Again, refer to the Vessel General Permit for the exact testing that must be carried out. And these sample results must be submitted as part of the annual report that is part of the Vessel General Permit. So we've discussed the regulations, and we've come up with a fact at this point that it is clear that there is only one possible way to meet all of the requirements at this time, and that is the installation of AMS systems. And we'll talk a little about what AMS systems are and what they mean. What AMS systems mean is that the U.S. Coast Guard allows installation of these AMS-approved systems, provided that type-approved systems, U.S. Coast Guard type-approved systems, are not available for the vessel or the vessel's route, or are available for the class or type of vessel in question. Once there are sufficient U.S. Coast Guard type-approved systems available, AMS systems are no longer allowed to be installed. Systems that have already been installed will be allowed to continue throughout their 5-year following implementation date standard approvals. As has been stated a few times, AMS systems can be used for 5 years following the implementation date for the vessel. Regardless of when the system is installed, you have 5 years from the date that the vessel would have had to install a ballast water management system to use the AMS system. And again, this 5 years is intended to give the manufacturer time to achieve U.S. Coast Guard type approval for the system as has been installed. Finally, AMS systems, by nature of best available technology, are fully compliant with the EPA's Vessel General Permit requirements. So the advantages of AMS to owners are many. First, vessels with, and this is one of the ones that's not terribly apparent, but vessels with AMS systems are exempt from needing to meet discharge standards when in the United States. I'll say that again to make sure that's understood. Vessels with AMS systems are exempt from having to meet any numeric discharge standards when they're in the U.S. By definition, an AMS-approved system meets the regulations and meets the discharge standard for a 5-year period following the implementation date for the vessel. Again, for a new construction vessel, that could be as long as 10 years following delivery, that a system may be capable of being installed and have no fear or no potential for being found to be non-compliant with the discharge standard. Second, owners with AMS systems have no liability for lawsuit under the Clean Water Act. Again, AMS systems are fully compliant with the Vessel General Permit. Third, AMS systems allow owners to stop doing ballast water exchange unless they're calling on a port that, in addition to ballast water management or ballast water treatment, require ballast water exchange. Again, this is an area to look at your 401A certifications under the Vessel General Permit for the states that you may be visiting. Number 4, owners may certainly use this period of time in the AMS approval period to use and gain experience with ballast water management systems without fear of penalty or fear of detainment or fear of interference with vessel normal operations due to the ballast water treatment system or enforcement of the ballast water treatment standard. Finally, for many owners, the environmental impacts and lessening the environmental impact of the vessel can be very important. And so AMS systems certainly provide the owners with a great capability to demonstrate that they're doing the most to be proactive in protecting the environment that their vessels are transiting in. So AMS systems are certainly a road forward. It's important to note that AMS systems do not guarantee U.S. Coast Guard type approval. And so let's look at U.S. Coast Guard type approval to see the road between the AMS bridge and what the future for permanent installations on board ships in the U.S. is. U.S. Coast Guard, under the final rule, requires that all ballast water management systems must, in order to discharge water into U.S. waters, must be type approved in accordance with 46 CFR 16260. There's a little difference between U.S. Coast Guard type approval and IMO type approval. IMO type approval primarily covers the efficacy or the discharge of organisms from a ballast water management system, with a small emphasis placed on the suitability for service and the operation of the system. But largely, suitability for service is left to the class societies. The U.S. Coast Guard, however, has no such differentiation. The U.S. Coast Guard type approval covers both the design and the efficacy of a ballast water management system. As such, numerous other sections of the CFRs, 46 CFR in particular, are called in. For example, subchapters F and J, which is not readily apparent in the U.S. Coast Guard final rule. While the U.S. Coast Guard type approval efficacy standards meets the IMO standards, however, there are also many certain key testing differences between the U.S. Coast Guard final rule and the IMO G8. And some of these differences have precluded ballast water treatment systems tested in the past from being able to be certified immediately under U.S. Coast Guard type approval. A couple of those key differences highlighted here on this slide. Under IMO G8, systems must be tested in multiple salinities. You must test them in 2 salinities, and they must be at least 10 PSU different. In the U.S. Coast Guard final rule, you're required to test in 3 salinities, under 1 PSU, and then a brackish, and then full salt. If you fail to test in any one of those 3, you receive a requirement that your system is not allowed to operate in that salinity. Under G8, they're required a 5-day hold time. U.S. Coast Guard final rule mandates a maximum of 1-day hold time unless the system will receive, again, a restriction that the ballast must be held for a certain period of time. Under IMO G8, you need 3 successive shipboard runs. Invalid runs do not count against this consecutive run. U.S. Coast Guard final rule requires 5 consecutive successful valid shipboard runs. Under the IMO G8, only the successful test runs must be reported. And under the U.S. Coast Guard, all official tests done under the IL, whether or not they pass and whether or not they are valid, must be reported to the Coast Guard. And finally, and most importantly, under IMO G8, the IMO allows the test labs to determine the best testing method, particularly for the establishment of viability, whereas the U.S. Coast Guard mandates a very specific test for the establishment of viability in the discharge organisms. One other key difference is that the U.S. Coast Guard requires all testing done for U.S. Coast Guard type approval to be done at an independent lab. These labs must be certified by the U.S. Coast Guard, and at this point in time, only 2 labs have this certification. The NSF Labs here in the U.S. received this certification in 2012, and recently at the end of 2013, DNV also received this certification. There are other groups attempting to get this certification, but at this point, there are only 2 labs that are capable of doing U.S. Coast Guard type approval testing for all of the ballast water treatment systems on the market. There is an opportunity that vendors may submit their existing data from previous IMO G8 tests to the independent lab for review and acceptability so that the lab may rule whether or not it is in accordance with the CFRs and whether it's in accordance with the U.S. Coast Guard final rule, and then they may submit that data to the U.S. Coast Guard for their review and approval or their review and determination of gaps. As this rule has been in place for 2 years, it may be very difficult for ballast water treatment system providers at this point to submit new data to the Coast Guard, as these labs have been in place for 2 years for the NSF Lab, but this doorway still remains open for treatment system providers to try and get previous test results approved for use in gaining U.S. Coast Guard type approval. So the last primary topic we'll talk about is the U.S. Coast Guard and UV issue. As most of you know, there's a perceived U.S. Coast Guard UV issue, and we'll discuss some of the pertinent details of that. As we said, the U.S. Coast Guard final rule incorporates the use of a very specific stain, a CMFDA-FDA dual stain for the establishment of viability. This stain measures the respiration potential of a cell and cell wall integrity. It does not measure the cell's capability to reproduce. As UV affects DNA and prevents reproduction, it does not necessarily cease cellular activity or disrupt cellular membranes. And so the CMFDA-FDA stain can have a high degree of false positive readings for UV systems and not indicate proper UV performance. Under G8, most UV systems were tested using a scientific method known as the most probable number assay, or MPN, that utilizes a growth potential for each cell to establish how many viable cells were in the solution at discharge. Although this process takes longer than a simple staining technique, it is internationally recognized as a superior method for the identification of viability in cells, particularly cells treated with UV. Recognizing this issue, the U.S. Coast Guard has reconvened a technical panel to discuss implementing MPN and incorporating it in their test protocols. The U.S. Coast Guard, the EPA, many UV ballast water treatment vendors, most of the test facilities in the world, and numerous key stakeholders are on this panel, and the panel is currently working on performing tests at many different facilities to validate MPN for the U.S. Coast Guard and for this panel. The latest panel meeting was in January of this year, and the panel will meet again probably early this summer to continue their work towards validating the MPN testing. Alternately, there is another path for U.S. Coast Guard type approval. The U.S. Coast Guard does allow vendors of equipment to request a variance from these rule-required tests. These variance requests must be submitted to the U.S. Coast Guard in writing prior to the commencement of testing. These variance paths, or these variance requests, may allow UV systems to be tested in advance of a change to the ETV protocol. The important key factor, however, is to remember that the MPN is a scientifically acceptable method that has been used by the EPA for years in establishment of drinking water and wastewater and other water treatment testing, and it's simply a matter of being able to prove the effectiveness of this test at the multiple different sites that will be used for U.S. Coast Guard type approval testing in order to validate and create the level of comfort to be able to add this to the Coast Guard's test procedure. If anyone is interested, Hyde Marine has been pursuing type approval testing for some time. Once the NSF laboratories were first brought in to the independent lab group in 2012, we immediately began negotiating with them to conduct testing. Due to this issue, the staining issue, the NSF indicated they had an inability to test the Hyde Guardian. And so recently, Hyde Marine has entered into an agreement with DNV in order to conduct testing hopefully later this year at their laboratory, which is capable of doing testing in the manner which we feel is appropriate for our system. That ends my portion of the webinar. I'd like to open up the floor to questions at this point. And if you have any questions, please direct them via chat or via Q&A to the host.
Thank you, Mark. Our first question is, what is an approved EPA lab? Do you know of any?
The EPA requires a certain ISO testing. Again, it's defined in the Vessel General Permit rule. Labs that are certified to do that testing should be certified to do that. The intent of this is not to create another independent lab group like the U.S. Coast Guard has. It is intended to be a broad spectrum of laboratories that can do this testing. So I would caution you to look into your local areas where your vessels operate and look for facilities that are rated by the EPA to conduct groundwater testing, well water testing, and such, as these tests are very similar to the tests carried out or requested under the Vessel General Permit.
Does AMS approval still require sampling as per the EPA?
The EPA, yes. The EPA sampling requirements must be carried out regardless of the system installed, whether that system is a U.S. Coast Guard type approved system, whether it's an AMS system, whether it's an IMO approved system, or whether it is not approved by anybody. The only thing that changes is the frequency of testing.
You stated that AMS systems, by definition, meet numeric standards. Is this true for EPA VGP limits? Where do you find language in that permit that supports that?
The EPA Vessel General Permit, I believe, I could look it up, but my screen would get crazy. I believe it's 2.2.3.5.3.2 is the section of the requirement which states the applicability of the AMS system. The EPA Vessel General Permit simply requires an operator to use best available technology and conduct sampling. This sampling is then posted, and the numeric discharge limits are needing to be monitored. However, I have to double check on the specific requirements in the VGP to find out exactly on whether or not what the status on the numeric discharge limits are.
Is MERC also approved?
MERC is part of the NSF Lab. So they are a sub-lab of the NSF group. They and the GSI lab up in Duluth, Minnesota are and the Rutliff laboratories in New Jersey are a part of the NSF group. So yes, MERC is an approved laboratory as part of the NSF group.
What are the repercussions, will there be fines, if vessels do not install a ballast water treatment system or equivalent by January 2016?
Obviously, enforcement at this point is an open question that I can't answer to or can't speak to what the Coast Guard or EPA will do. At this point, if U.S. Coast Guard type approved systems are available at that time, the ship must install one of those systems. If the ship owner at that time there are no U.S. Coast Guard type approval systems available, or if the ship owner is in a hardship situation, they may request a second extension from the U.S. Coast Guard. However, that's a determination, that the U.S. Coast Guard will have to make at that time.
How will vessels know they have non-compliant discharges for reporting on their annual VGP report? Do they have to test every discharge?
They do not have to test every discharge. However, there are, I believe, 3 discharges that are required to be tested under the Vessel General Permit, and they are a gray water discharge, maybe black water, I apologize, I'm not as familiar with that, bilge water and ballast water. The ballast water sampling must be done in accordance with what I've stated before, and there are specific ISO tests that must be done. And if you are compliant, you can indicate that. If your vessel is non-compliant, you simply must test back to the higher scale, the twice a year for high quality data, 4 times a year for low quality data.
What options might we have to determine or demonstrate efficacy now that systems are fitted besides full biosampling?
That's a good question. At Hyde Marine, we've been working with a number of groups to try and answer that question. We have been in conversations with a number of groups, including most notably the NEOS laboratory, in developing what we call the B box, which is a small box which can be tested at a much less, approximately 1/10 of the cost of a full IMO level test, and it can give an owner an indication of whether or not the system is functioning. It does test all 3 size classes: indicator organisms 10 to 50 microns, and organisms greater than 50 microns. And Hyde Marine has equipped our field service teams with the capability to come on board and do this. We've offered this service to a number of our customers to help prove our system's function after installation and after some period of time. Other than that, there are, again, these indicator tests that are listed in the EPA. There are also a number of test equipment providers that are working at developing such a test. The U.S. Coast Guard has an open request for this type of a compliance tool. I know we have personally worked with Hawk, Turner Technologies, Chelsea Technologies. I'm going to forget somebody, I apologize. But we've worked with a number of companies at developing and fine-tuning their equipment with our ballast water treatment systems in order to provide our owners and our customers with the comfort and peace of mind of knowing that their system is working.
A statement from an attendee: the problem for a ship owner who wishes to fit a system and be compliant would now appear to be that a system that may have AMS status has no guarantee of finally being U.S. Coast Guard approved. Thus, there is a possibility of paying out for a system which subsequently becomes unusable in U.S. waters.
And that is, of course, the risk. And we certainly at Hyde Marine, we appreciate that that's the risk of AMS. At this point in time, in order to be fully compliant, the owner has to take a certain measure of risk associated with that. It's very important that when you choose an AMS-approved system, that the owner consider the manufacturer and consider if that system will be capable of achieving type approval within that 5-year window and with the minimum interruption or disruption. There are certainly a lot of unique features of the U.S. Coast Guard. Hyde Marine has been involved with the U.S. Coast Guard for a long time and has installed a number of systems on U.S. flagged ships and under the U.S. Coast Guard inspection, and so we very clearly understand the risks that are being taken. And it's very incumbent upon the owner to choose a provider that will be able to get through to the other side and provide the owner with either a fully compliant type approved system today, or at least provide a clear path forward with the minimal impact to the owner for anything that may come up during the type approval process. Obviously, there may be some small modifications that are needed due to something that comes up during that testing, but again, it becomes incumbent upon the owners to really pay attention and do their homework on companies and how they've been able to develop their product, how they've moved forward, and the retrofitability of their improvements to existing equipment.
And last question, what are the water pollutant criteria that a ballast water system must comply to?
The water pollutant criteria for a ballast water treatment system. I think I don't know if the question relates to the efficacy standards. There will be the 10 organisms less than 50 or greater than 50 microns per cubic meter, the less than 10 organisms per milliliter from 10 to 50, and the under 250 CFUs of the 3 indicator organisms. I know there are a significant number of additional requirements under the Vessel General Permit for chemical-based systems. There are a significant number of disinfection byproducts, neutralization agents, and disinfection agents that need to be monitored, that need to be constantly monitored and have high discharge limits as part of the EPA's Vessel General Permit. Again, I refer you to the Vessel General Permit. There's a table in Section 2.3 which indicates what those discharge requirements are. It also refers you to FIFRA, which is the U.S. Act on the discharge of pesticides, insecticides, rodenticides, and fungicides. But there are a significant number of standards that the chemical systems, as a UV treatment system, those aren't at the tip of my fingers. I apologize for that. But I do know that there are a number of instantaneous limits and instantaneous maximums that need to be met during discharge.
Thanks, Bart. This concludes our webinar. You can check back on the Hyde Marine website in the Hyde Marine Academy section for a recording of this webinar session. Again, if you have any further questions, feel free to email us at sales@hydemarine.com, and keep an eye out for future webinars on our website. Thank you again for your attendance.